We're going to be talking about different types of inductive arguments in this particular lecture. For those that are interested in knowing more about deductive arguments, that's fine. Again, they're a little bit more rare, especially in theology and ethics and some of these others, not altogether outside of the realm, but just more rare. But if you want more information, I've got plenty of resources and other things that can help you with deductive arguments, and I'm willing to work with you. For the purposes of this class, I'm going to emphasize inductive reasoning, at least in these lectures. And so we're going to go over 3 types of inductive arguments, and then we're going to look at several informal fallacies, common mistakes in reasoning. Again, some of this is in Chapter 5 of Woodhouse, but a lot of this isn't. So let's get started. So the first type of informal fallacy we're going to cover is generalizations. These are often, we encounter them all the time. One of the most common, in fact, is, as elections approach, you hear about polls. Who's leading the polls, who's not leading the polls. Now, polls are headed up by very, very smart people who know how to derive a lot of information from a very small sample. And they do this by getting the most effective sample possible. They want to get the right kinds of demographics of a given state or county, even the nation, age groups. They want to break it down in such a way that based on this small sample, they can project, make a generalization about how the whole city, the whole state, the whole nation will vote. It's amazing how effective polls are. They are almost always right. And essentially, these are inductive arguments based on probability by taking a small sample, then generalizing to larger populations. There's a generic form of generalizations. Premise 1, X% of observed F's are G's. Conclusion from that premise, X% of all F's are G's. The big difference here is observed from all. So in a political poll, we say X% of polled males under 25 voted for Obama. And then we say, as a result, we think that 25% of the entire city's 25-year-old males are going to vote for Obama, or whatever. So you take from what you polled, make a generalization outward. Another example, 90% of observed accountants are boring. Sorry if any of you are an accountant. Therefore, 90% of all accountants are boring, right? Sample generalization. So how do we evaluate generalizations, right? What are the conditions or criteria of strength? One thing we want to look at with generalizations is the sample. Is the sample representative? Is it large enough? Is it diverse enough, right? So I'll give an example. I talked earlier about I've met 2 police officers. Both of them were jerks. Therefore, all police officers are jerks. In this particular case, my sample size is way too small. I've sampled 2, and I'm making a generalization about hundreds of thousands, right? That's a real problem. Plus, saying that they're a jerk is often very subjective and whatnot. But we could change it and make it a good generalization if we were talking about, let's say we polled 25 U.S. cities and we found that 9% of police officers, only 9% of police officers had used their gun in the last decade. And then we make a generalization that says it is unlikely, or it is very rare that police officers generally, right, have to use their weapons. Well, from that large sample, and given the very low percentage that people use guns, then we generalize and say police officers don't have to use their guns that much, right? I'm not saying that what those premises and conclusions are true. Hypothetically speaking, though, that would be a better argument if there was data to support our premises, right? Larger sample size, more structured, better data to support the generalization. So one of the things you want to ask is the sample size large enough to make the generalization? Another thing to think about, this is about being critical, right? Critical thinking. Is the sample size large enough? And is it proportional to the conclusion? For instance, If I wanted to make a generalization about NNU's campus, I would need a much smaller sample size than if I wanted to make a generalization about the United States as a whole. So if I wanted to say, make a generalization about how NNU students feel about Barack Obama's administration, I might only need to get 50 students, if it's a good strong sample, to make a generalization about 1,000, right? But if I only pulled 50 people and I wanted to make a conclusion about the United States, that would be way too small. So you have to use some critical thinking here, right? It's based on probability. It's not a science. It's a little bit of a skill set, an art. Is the sample size proportional to the conclusion? And then, of course, does the sample size have enough variety in it? So if I wanted to find out how NNU students feel about the Obama administration, but let's say I set up my polling booth, I got my data, and I set it up outside of the NNU Republican meeting. And that's where I got the people to participate in my survey to get my data. Well, that's not a very, the sample lacks variety. It's not going to give me an accurate sample of NNU students as a whole because they're most likely to all be Republican. And Republicans have a particular view of the Obama administration. So it would be much better to go to the cafeteria, try to poll as many different kinds, both genders, different age groups, different political affiliations. And if I got a sample size of 50, 60, 70 that was really varied, I'd probably have a good indication of how the campus feels, right? So you want to have enough variety there. Again, if I only want to know how NNU Republicans feel about the Obama administration, then polling only Republicans is perfectly appropriate. But if I want to know how all NNU students feel about the Obama administration, then it has to have more variety to it. So again, it takes these principles of critical thinking. There are several fallacies associated with generalizations. We've mentioned them already, but I want to get the language, right? Hasty generalization. This is when you make a generalization when your sample size is too small. I've met 2 police officers, they're both jerks, therefore all police officers are jerks. That is the fallacy of a hasty generalization. I've mentioned that when you want to make a conclusion about human nature and you use one specific example of your child, human beings are selfish because when my son was growing up and he was 2, all he said was mine. I never taught him that. Therefore, all children are selfish. Well, that's a hasty generalization from your own personal experience to making a generalization about the entire human race, right? Biased stats. This is when the sample does not have enough variety. So if I sit outside the NNU Republican meeting, and then I poll people coming out, and I say, oh, NNU students generally feel this way about the Obama administration, well, those are biased stats because I didn't get enough variety within my sample. And then the final fallacy, and this is just about human nature a little bit, misleading vividness. You allow a recent negative or positive experience to override statistical data. I can imagine being on a plane and having a really awful landing, turbulence. You can tell the flight attendants are getting nervous, but you land and you make it okay. But because of that really vivid, terrifying experience, you begin to feel like driving is safer than flying. You make a generalization about plane travel from that vivid experience, when all the data suggests it's more dangerous to drive than to fly. More people die driving than flying, very few accidents with planes. So you allow a vivid experience to override good statistical data. That's also a fallacy that can occur. I hope this helps with generalizations. We're going to sort of move on to analogies. Sorry about that. Let me make this bigger for you. Another kind of inductive argument analogy. General form. Premise 1. X has properties A, B, C, and D. Premise 2. Well, Y has properties A, B, and C. Therefore, Y probably has property D as well. Again, you see the clear inductive word there. And we've talked about this briefly. An example might be medication in rats versus humans. So I'm a scientist. I want to see how this new hand lotion is going to affect human skin. I'm going to test it on rats. I'm going to rub the lotion all over the rats. I'm going to see how it affects their skin. And then how it affects their skin, I'm going to say, well, it's probably going to do the same thing to humans. We say rats are mammals, humans are mammals. Both warm-blooded. Both have skin and hair. So if I rub lotion on rats and it creates hives, it irritates the skin, I can say, well, there's enough parallel between human skin and rat skin, it's probably going to do the same thing to humans. It's not a flawless analogy, because humans are a lot different than rats too, so maybe it won't affect humans the same. But we try to create analogies because we don't want to use it on humans before we've tested on the other animals first, and then we try to create that analogy, what it does to these mammals that are somewhat similar to humans, it's most likely going to do to humans. Now, we use mammals instead of reptiles because mammals are more similar to humans. Reptiles are cold-blooded and have a very different circulatory system and whatnot. So what it does to a reptile, we can't make that good of an analogy to what it'll do to humans. But if we did it to rats and then other higher order mammals and then even monkeys, then we can get a better sense of what it might do to humans. But the basic form is, right, rats have these properties. Property D is how their skin reacts to the lotion. Premise 2 is humans have these same properties with rats. Therefore, humans will probably react the same to the lotion. Conditions of strength. So how do we evaluate analogies? There's two primary conditions of strength. One, what is the relevance between the similarities we've listed, right? A, B, and C. These are the similarities here. What is the relationship between the similarities in the premises and what's the similarity to the conclusion, right? So I can give you an example. This, I assume, maybe this has happened to some of you. A teacher in the 9th grade gets a student, Joan Johnson. And they say, Joan Johnson on the roll, right? Oh, Joan Johnson. Oh, there you are. Wait a second. Is your brother Jeff Johnson? And Joan says, yes, sheepishly. And this teacher says, oh, well, Jeff Johnson, in her mind, or his mind, Jeff Johnson was lazy, didn't show up on time, disrespectful, bad student. Well, Joan and Jeff have a lot of similarities. They have the same parents, they grew up in the same house, they were raised with the same value system, they attend or do not attend the same church. Well, all those similarities, well then clearly Joan is going to be lazy, disrespectful, and a bad student. Right? You're creating an analogy between brother and sister. Of course, this analogy is not good because it doesn't meet this criteria of strength. The similarities you've pointed out are not relevant to the conclusion you're trying to make. The fact that Joan and Jeff both grew up in the same home, have the same parents, right, share some of the same genetics, and raised with the same values. We know this does not translate to say, well, then just because Jeff's a bad student, therefore Joan's a bad student. There's no correlation between the similarities highlighted and the conclusion you're trying to make. And so that's a problem that you want to watch out for. If we wanted to talk about something that might be relevant, for instance, with my son, if my son has many of the same characteristics that I do, oh, he's got your hair color, eye color, he's about your height when you were that age, and then we say, well, therefore, he'll probably be coordinated like his dad. Well, that's a better analogy. There's more probability that that's the case because we know that coordination is the result of genetics. If my son has all these other traits in common with me, then he might have that genetic trait coordination as well. And so, so that would be a better analogy, but in this case, it's not a good one for this reason, right? You want to make sure the similarities are relevant for the conclusion you're making. The second criteria of strength. What is the degree of similarity versus dissimilarity between the two things being compared? The more similarities, the stronger the analogy. The more dissimilarity, the weaker the analogy. So again, if I try to look at the circulatory system of a leaf, I inject it with something and I watch how it goes through the leaf. And then I try to make conclusions about the human circulatory system. That's not a good analogy. There are some similarities between a leaf circulatory system, like a tree, roots a tree up to the leaf, and a human circulatory system. But there's way too many dissimilarities. If I use a lizard, and I make an analogy between the circulatory system of a lizard and a human, that's a better analogy than the tree. Still a lot of dissimilarities. But if I move up to a rat, a better analogy, more similarities. If I move up to a chimpanzee, an even better analogy, more similarities. If I then go from one human, if I look at Jane and her circulatory system, and then I make an analogy to John and his circulatory system, an even better analogy because there's more similarities between the two things being compared and less dissimilarity. I have an example I like to share with my students sometimes. It's true and it's ridiculous, but maybe you'll find it entertaining. So an example of a bad analogy based on the condition of strength number 2, right? Based on this criteria of strength. So I was in high school. I was a senior. I was heading towards graduation. I was dating a girl. It wasn't super serious, but somewhat. We had been dating for a few months, and we were getting along, and we were having fun. So we ended up going, we were going to go to different colleges, and so she came to me and wanted to break up. And it was essentially like, look, we're having a good time, and I really like you, but we're not super serious, and we both know that when we go off to college, we're not going to stay together, so we might as well save each other some heartache and break up now. And again, this is a few months before graduation in the summer. But I didn't want to break up, right? I mean, this is a great time of my life. It's going to be the summer before I go to college. I don't want to spend that all by myself, lonely. I'd rather be out having fun, going to the lake and doing some, hang out with my girlfriend. So I didn't really want to break up. And so I used the analogy. I said, well, look, when I buy you flowers and I give them to you, you know that the flowers are going to die, right? Okay. Well, why don't you just take the flowers and then throw them straight into the trash then? Since you know they're going to die in a week or so, why don't you just take them and throw them away right off? And I said, well, no, of course that's not what you do. You take the flowers, you put them in a vase, you put them somewhere in your room or in your house so you can enjoy them, see them, and then when they die, and that's sad, and you throw them away, but you enjoy them while you have them. I said, well, why can't we treat our relationship the same way? We know it's going to end when we go to college, but we have a few good months to hang out and have fun and interact with each other. Why don't we enjoy that the way we enjoy the flowers, and then when it comes to a natural end, we'll let it come to a natural end. So I made this analogy between our relationship and flowers. And it totally worked. And we stayed together until we went off to college. And it's effective. It was effective, and I get it. But it's not a good analogy for this reason. Our relationship were similar to a batch of flowers in one way. We knew they were both going to end or die. But there was like 1,000 other dissimilarities that I was ignoring. I was only highlighting the one similarity. And this happens a lot in analogies, and it can be tricky to pinpoint. It takes critical thinking to really see it, right? When flowers die and I throw them away, my heart isn't crushed and broken. But if I stay with you for 4 or 5 extra months and get that much closer to you and then have to go to a different college, well, that is heart-wrenching. So there's a ton of emotion involved in relationships that is not involved in flowers. I mean, you could go down the line of all the dissimilarities. So many things can happen in our relationship over the next few months that could create extra pain and whatnot versus flowers. So you get the point. The analogy wasn't great. It just happened to work. But these are the criteria of strength that you want to keep in mind. A false analogy, the fallacy of the false analogy, is when one of those two criteria of strength are violated. Famous example, theological argument for God's existence, or philosophical argument for God's existence. And most of you are familiar, I assume. Premise 1, things that show clear signs of complexity and purpose are the products, or are often the products, of a designer. So you know the famous example of a watch. William Paley makes the argument. You walk on a beach, you see a watch, it's keeping time. Do you assume that that watch came together by accident, or do you assume it had a designer? The idea was, of course, you assume it has a designer, because we recognize that when something like a watch, which is complex, it has a bunch of moving parts, and those parts come together to perform a function or have a purpose, we say it must have been designed. The wind didn't just blow these parts together randomly or by accident to make this happen. So when we see signs of complexity and purpose, there is often a designer, and with a watch that's true. Houses have designers, computers have designers. All these things show complexity and purpose, and they have to be designed. Premise 2, the universe demonstrates both complexity and purpose. The universe is very complex, from the very big down to the very small. Things serve a function, ecosystems serve a purpose. Each part of the human body has a specific purpose. I mean, everything seems to almost be in a delicate balance. All the laws of nature seem to be necessary and purposeful. Well, if premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then we can conclude that the universe is most likely the product of a designer, right? This is an inductive argument by analogy. Here are the similarities, right, between complexity, purpose, and a designer. The universe has these same similarities, complexity, and purpose. We then say it probably has this property C, a designer, as well. The question is, does this argument meet the criteria of strength mentioned on the previous page? If not, which criteria of strength is lacking? So I'll go back. Does the design argument meet these criteria of strength? I'll let you take a look. All right. It is often argued that the design argument fails because of criteria number 2. The argument is, if we try to compare the universe to a watch, you have a few similarities, complexity, purpose, but you have so many dissimilarities between the universe and a watch that the analogy ends up being weak. You can do the same thing if you try to compare the universe to a machine, the universe to a house, the universe to any kind of designed things. Yes, but the universe is similar in those 2 ways you highlighted, just like the flowers in my relationship, but you're ignoring all these other dissimilarities that make it hard to accept the analogy. Now, there are other stronger, I think, design arguments that can get around this objection, but as it stands, the argument by design in the analogy form, I think, does fall prey to this in some ways. But this is something that we would, that would create a longer, more sustained argument. And now, finally, I want to highlight sort of 3 common areas where we see argument by analogy. The most common you're going to find them in medicine. We've already talked about it. Doctors and researchers assume human bodies from one human to the next are the same. So if they look at the brain of one human, they assume the brain of the next human is pretty similar to that. If they see the circulatory system of one human, they assume. So if we see one person reacting in a given way to a particular virus or something, we can create a strong analogy that says, well, this other person's probably going to react the same way. Sometimes those analogies end up being false because humans are also different. But because there's so many similarities between one human body and the next, it's safe to make these kinds of analogies. We can make them stronger. We might say, well, young bodies react differently than older bodies. Thin bodies work differently than obese bodies. We can begin to hone in on those analogies, but medicine does this a lot. We see it in archaeology and history a lot. You dig up certain weapons, tools, we see certain kinds of paints and art being used, and we start to date things. Oh, well, these weapons weren't around until this time, right? And we compare it to other groups. We say, well, these similar kinds of tools were used like this over in Indonesia, so my guess is they're using these tools for this reason. And we create analogies from one culture to the next, from one time period to the next. These analogies are not foolproof, obviously, but it's a way of trying to derive conclusions by probability. And then, of course, we see them in legal arguments. It's what's known as legal precedent. So if you have a case, right, I'm trying to sue the city for some reason, I'm going to look up a bunch of other cases that had similar lawsuits where a person fell on a sidewalk or something. How did the court rule? What were the circumstances surrounding that case? Are mine similar to it? If there's enough similarities, then you can go and say, well, look, in this other case, this is how the judge ruled, this is how the jury ruled, and so my case is sufficiently similar that you should rule the same way. And you use legal precedent as an analogy. Of course, if you're opposing that, if you're legal counsel opposing that, Your job is to point out the relevant dissimilarities. Well, yes, Your Honor, certainly there are some similarities between the two cases, but this dissimilarity means you should rule differently. And so you have this argument by analogy there. I hope this helps. We're going to go to one more type, so hang with me. Again, if you need to pause me or something, that's fine. But we'll talk about causal arguments briefly and do some informal fallacies. All right. Causal arguments. 3 different methods of causal argument. These are also inductive. We'll talk about them in terms of 3 methods. One is the method of agreement. When we use the method of agreement to identify the causes of some event or condition, we look at antecedent circumstances to see whether some antecedent circumstance is common in each occurrence of the event for which a cause is sought. Example, people getting sick on a plane. Let's say there's a plane from Japan to Copenhagen, and by the time you arrive in Copenhagen, 40% of the passengers are ill with food poisoning. Well, it's not hard to see how you might find a common cause. The first, I'll ask you critical thinkers, what's the first thing you're going to look at? 40% have gotten ill and are throwing up in the bathrooms, right? You're going to look, what did they eat? That doesn't make it right, that's not that hard. Well, the argument becomes pretty strong if the 40% of people who are sick all had the fish, and the 60% of people who didn't get sick either didn't eat or had the vegetarian dish. So you start to say, oh, well, there's agreement, right? These circumstances indicate that the same 40% that are sick are all the same people that ate the same dish. There's a good probability that that's what caused them to be ill. So the criteria for agreement, you want to get a general background information. For instance, if people get sick, one of the common ways people get sick is because of what they eat. So we have general background information that says eating something is relevant to being sick. It's not the only relevant thing that might get us sick, but it's something we ought to look at rather than something totally irrelevant. Like 40% of the people got sick on this flight. You know, most of those people have brown eyes. So I think the brown eyes is what caused them to get sick. Well, background information tells us that that's not relevant to making someone throw up. And this is similar, right? You want to make general information about the types of causes that bring about the condition in question. So this is similar to what we're talking about, right? Be sure that the cause in question is relevant for the effect. Method of difference, the second method, when we're talking about causation. To find the cause of event E, we should try to find 2 cases, one where E occurs and one where it does not, that are similar in all respects but one in their circumstances. Then the antecedent circumstance that is present when E is present and absent when E is not is probably the cause of E. So for instance, if I go out to my car won't start, and I think about it, I did everything the same, right? I put it in park, I put the key in the ignition, I turn the key. So many days I've done the same exact thing and it's worked each time. What's different about today? Oh, I forgot to get gas. Well, if that's the one difference, then you're like, oh, well, then I probably ran out of gas, right? Everything else being equal, what is different about this time? That helps. We talk about allergies. Again, every time I go over to Julie's house, I feel fine. There's no problem at all. But this time when I went over to Julie's house, she had a cat, a brand new kitten, and my allergies acted up. Well, every time I've been over there before, my allergies never acted up. What's different this time? She's got a cat. That's probably what caused it, right? So you can start to figure out what the cause of something is by what's different. Again, doctors do this all the time to diagnose what's causing certain symptoms. They use both agreement and difference. Same criteria. General background about, we know cats often cause allergies. There's a connection there. It would be irrelevant if you went and said, oh, well, Julie got red drapes. The color red must be making me allergic. we know that there's no connection between colors and allergies. Now, maybe something in the drapes is causing your allergies to act up the fabric or something, because we know that can play a role, but certainly not the color. The final method is a fun one, concomitant variation. The methods of agreement and difference depend on a particular causal agent being present or absent, but variation, on the other hand, should be applied when the condition or event under investigation varies in degree or strength from one case to another. So you see, it's not an all or nothing, it's more or less depending on whether something's present more or less. So you might take soil samples, and you see that as selenium increases in the soil, you see increases in cases of cancer. As you see in environments where there's a decrease in selenium, you see decrease in cancer. And you see this constant variation between the two. You can start to say the level of selenium is relevant, is one causal factor for cancer. Smoking and lung cancer, right? That you can see that people who smoke and the amount they smoke and the percentages of those that get lung cancer, there's a direct correlation. Those who don't smoke have a direct correlation of having less lung cancer. And we begin to use this notion of variation to make a causal claim. I hope this is helping and making sense. We're going to do one last piece. We're going to talk about some fallacies. Again, if you need to take a break, that's fine. I understand. We're going to emphasize informal fallacies, and we'll go through like a list. I think there's 9. We'll sort of talk about them each briefly. I believe 5 or 6 of these are in your text. They should help. Ad hominem fallacy is one of my favorites. This is when you attack a person's character rather than their ideas or arguments. This happens all the time. I just taught a class and we were talking about evolution and other things, and a student said, well, Darwin was a racist. And so, we can't really trust evolution. Again, that's attacking Darwin's character, and maybe that's true, right? Maybe lots of people in the 19th century were racists. So maybe he was, but that has nothing to do with whether evolution is true or false. It's totally irrelevant, right? Evolution fails or succeeds based on scientific evidence, not on the character of the scientist in question. Imagine if I made the argument, all of our founding fathers were racist. Most of them owned slaves. Therefore, the Constitution is null and void. It has no merit because the Constitution framers owned slaves. Well, most of you would say, well, no, the fact that they owned slaves is not really relevant to whether the ideas regarding the Constitution were good or bad. The ideas have to be critiqued on their own merit, not based on the character of the person involved. Clearly, sometimes character is really relevant, right? If I want to know who my daughter should marry or who my son should date or, right, who I want heading up my department at the university, I want to know about character. But when we're talking about arguments, ideas, evidence, and whatnot, the person's character is not relevant to whether their argument is true or false, right? Next, appeal to false authority. Oh, I'm sorry. One other thing I wanted to say briefly. People often in certain classes, want to dismiss Plato or Aristotle or others because they're not Christian. So it's essentially like, well, Aristotle is a pagan, so everything he said is false. That's an ad hominem fallacy. You can't write off these people simply because they're not Christian or they had a different religious tradition. They're making arguments. They're telling you about politics, morality, logic, and they're making cases, and you've got to either support or reject their ideas based on the merit of their ideas and whether they can be supported or not on Aristotle's personal beliefs. Okay? So it's important to note. Appeal to false authority. It's not wrong to appeal to authority. So if I want to know about a medical issue and I call several doctors and ask them, that's not appealing to false authority, that's appealing to a good authority, an expert. But we often see appeals to false authority, right? So this is when Tom Cruise gets on the TV and tells me who to vote for, or Michael Jordan tries to sell me underwear. These people are not authorities or experts in the area in question. They have no training in the area in question, and so their voice should not command authority. So when you appeal to them, you're appealing to a false authority. Slippery slope, common one. I find it interesting because both political parties use this so often, right? So a slippery slope argument is something like this. Let's take an issue, the right to bear arms. Those who are opposed, right, who don't think people should be able to have guns, or at least shouldn't have certain guns. So an argument is put forth that sounds something like this. Well, we can't let people have automatic rifles. We can't let people have rifles that have high-powered scopes or grenade launchers or something. Because if we allow that, where will it end? People will begin to have, bombs in their homes. People will begin to have all kinds of high-powered weapons, and so we've got to just do away with guns entirely, because if we allow any guns, we're going to end up with these horrible weapons, right? It means if we take one step in this direction, we're going to hit a slippery slope, and end up all the way at the bottom in some bad place we don't want to be. But that's a fallacy. It's also called the line drawing fallacy. Maybe we want to allow handguns for home protection, and we want to draw a line there and not allow the automatic weapons that are often used by criminals and others, where hunters don't need to use automatic weapons and home security doesn't need them. So we just draw a line. So we can take one step, draw a line, without falling all the way to the bottom. Those on the opposite end of the spectrum use similar logic. Well, if we take away a person's right to bear arms, what's next? What else is the government going to take away from us? Pretty soon, the government's not going to let us, right, X, Y, and Z. And so what other constitutional rights will they violate? What else? Well, no. I mean, it's possible, right, to take away automatic weapons and implement certain criteria like background checks and all that without taking away the entire right to bear arms, or drawing a line there without taking away other rights. It's typically fear-based. Slippery slopes are really effective because they create fear in us, and so we're like, yeah, we can't take this one step, because if we take this one step, who knows where it'll lead? Well, no, you have to evaluate each step on its own merit. What are you trying to do? Eliminate automatic weapons. Do we all think that's a good idea? On its own, can we defend automatic weapons without saying, well, if we take away automatic weapons, then we're going to lose all of our guns? Well, no. Let's just talk about this one issue. If we all agree here, then we do away with that. Then we'll talk about handguns. Oh, we like handguns to stay? Okay, well, then that's where we draw the line. And you can handle each issue one at a time rather than using fear as a slippery slope. Again, that's just one example, but honestly, almost every moral and political issue, both sides of the line are guilty of slippery slope. False dichotomy. This is when you frame an issue as though it only has two sides when there are more than two. So, for instance, a famous line from George Bush after 9/11, you're either for us or you're against us. You either support our efforts or you're our enemy. Well, obviously, there are more options. There are countries that say, well, we support the United States 90% of the time, but we don't think the war on terror is a good idea. So we support you most of the time, but on this area we don't, but I don't think that makes us an enemy. So creating this either or when there are more options available is a false dichotomy. Now, some dichotomies are real. It is either this or it's that, and that's okay. But if you're neglecting other options, then it's false. A famous example, I can't remember now who wrote the book, but I read it. It was really famous when I was in high school. But it's essentially put forth the argument that we have three options with Jesus. He's either the Lord, who he says he was, he's either a liar, or he's a lunatic. Right? You have three options: Lord, liar, lunatic. But of course, this is a false dichotomy because there are other options. We don't have any writings from Jesus, only from Jesus' followers that they wrote, and they wrote these things after Jesus had died. So it's possible that Jesus never said he was the Son of God, that Jesus didn't believe he was the Son of God, and that he was just a good guy who went around and had wonderful teachings, and the people that wrote them down exaggerated them. I don't think that that's true. That's just possible. It's a fourth option. So when you say it's either this or that, right, or this, then and there's no other options, then that's a false dichotomy. We have to deal with all the relevant options, and if you eliminate all but one, then the one that's standing is most likely true. But if you've only dealt with three options and there are three others over here that you haven't dealt with, you can see how that really kills the probability of the one standing. Red herring. This is a fun one. This is when you're in the middle of a disagreement and you shoot off a distraction flare, like, and everyone like looks over there. And I do this with my wife. She gets me cornered on something. We argue some, and I'm a philosopher, and I'm sort of doing my thing, and then all of a sudden I realize, oh man, she's got a really good point, and I feel a little bit trapped. And then I say something like, well, you did the same thing last week. And then suddenly she goes, no, I didn't. Well, yes, you did. Remember this? And then all of a sudden, we're arguing about what she did, not what I did. Red herring. Very effective, but not good, right? Because it's irrelevant to the topic at hand. My wife has gotten so good, both of us, at saying, oh, you think I did that last week? Okay, well, if you'd like to talk about that, we can talk about that after. But right now, what we're talking about is what you did. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, crap, she didn't go for it. All right, well, let's talk about this. Another thing she'll say is, oh, you were upset when I did that 2 weeks ago? That's funny because you didn't bring it up then. It's only now when you feel cornered that you brought it up. Next time, maybe you should bring that up a little sooner, right? So she refuses to get off topic, which is unfortunate. Begging the question, or circular reasoning. This happens when the premise and the conclusion continue to beg the question of the other, and there's no way of getting out. It's almost like a little bit of a vicious circle. In your book, this one is highlighted. I'm going to try to find the page number here. Page number 81, and they have several good examples that I think you should look at. In certain situations, begging the question can occur. As an example, if we're talking about the inerrancy of Scripture, and your evidence for why Scripture is inerrant is because Scripture itself says it is inerrant, that it's reliable and inerrant in all things pertaining to teaching, correction, and all that, right? You can't use the Bible to prove the Bible because that becomes circular. I'm asking you why the Bible is valid, why the Bible is inerrant, and then you say, well, because the Bible says it's inerrant. Right, but why is it inerrant? Because it says it's inerrant. And you end up in this circle, right, of reasoning. And so you want to avoid that. Aristotle gets accused of circular reasoning a little bit with ethics because he'll say, you ought to embody the virtues. And then a question gets posed to him, well, how do I know what the virtues are? And he'll say, well, look to the magnanimous person. Look to the person who's virtuous. And then the person says, well, how will I know who to look at? And he says, the person embodying virtue. But I want to know what virtue is. Yeah, look to the magnanimous person, the one who embodies the virtues. But how do I know who that person is? Well, it's the person who embodies that virtue. And it ends up looking circular. Straw man fallacy. This is something that all of you most likely will be guilty of in your papers from time to time, so you want to be careful here. Straw man is when you articulate another person's views, so you're going to say, this is what Aristotle says about ethics. But you set Aristotle up in a way that is weak. You don't give him the best articulation of his views. You don't formulate his ideas well. You set up a straw man, and then you go about attacking him based on the straw man you set up. But straw men are easy to attack. You essentially set up a weak version of Aristotle's argument that's not faithful to his actual views. You then destroy that straw man and feel like you've won the argument. You really, really want to avoid this. Instead, give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. Set them up with the strongest possible formulation of their ideas. Then when you can effectively defeat their arguments, you've defeated the best possible version, not the weakest possible version. Genetic fallacies in the text. I'm going to skip that one briefly and go to post hoc. This is the causal fallacy that we mentioned, when two things are not related, but we assume that one caused the other. There are lots of funny examples, like in sports, I ate eggs 7 straight days, and I have a 7-game hitting streak in baseball, but then I had French toast, and I didn't get a hit. Clearly, I didn't get a hit because I didn't eat eggs, right? It's the method of difference. The only thing that was different is that I ate French toast instead of eggs. That must be it. But we know there's no relationship between what you eat for breakfast and getting a hit. It's just superstition. Maybe that pitcher was a Hall of Famer that night, and that's why you didn't get a hit. Maybe you were tired. It's just luck of the draw. Maybe you hit a couple line drives, but it just went right at the shortstop. So post hoc fallacies when we try to create causal connections when they're only accidental, right? Then we have a couple of emotional manipulation, and this is the end of this particular lecture here. Poisoning the well is when you start out by saying, oh, for instance, if I went up and said, did you hear what that no-good jerk Jake said the other day? Well, I've already poisoned the well, because basically now whoever's listening to me is predisposed to know that whatever Jake said was bad or wrong or false or a lie. So you're not giving Jake the benefit of the doubt. You're not formulating his arguments objectively. You're poisoning everyone around you by the way you start the sentence out. Emotionally loaded language. Many of you have to be careful of this in your papers. You will use words like, you'll use emotionally charged language because you vehemently disagree with some idea. And so instead of trying to look at the ideas themselves, you'll sort of, with your language, you'll be letting the reader know how bad this person is, this idea is, this thing is. But the language itself is not necessarily necessary or even accurate, but it's more emotionally charged. So critical thinking demands that we sort of sift out that kind of language and really try to be accurate in the way we talk about a person's ideas. That doesn't mean we can't disagree. Of course we can disagree. It's how we handle it that is most important. I hope this stuff helps. If you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And again, good luck. I'll continue to see you online.